So I hope you were able to see the similarity class with your obligations and contracts. If in your discussion of obligations class, of course, it will be discussed the sources of obligations. What are the sources of obligations? Laws, contracts, quasi contracts, acts or omissions, and quasi delicts. So basically, here it's the same. Remember that rights, one kind of right represents those that will impose an obligation to other persons. Okay, so basically, the same sources of obligations class could be a source of rights for other people. Okay, if laws, contracts, quasi contracts, acts or omissions, and quasi delicts can be a source of an obligation class, then that means the same sources could also be a source for rights to other people. Okay, and here the framework expressly tells us that rights are established by contract, legislation, meaning laws, but of course we are not just limited here. Uh, it's possible for you to obtain rights class by acquiring or creating a know-how that is not in the public domain, meaning not in the public domain class, meaning it's not available for everyone. It's proprietary in nature. You can say that it belongs to you, but you do not even have to have a legal right over this knowledge class as long as this knowledge is not known to the general public class. Then that knowledge could be considered as a source of a right that can result in an asset. At this point, you did not bother yourself so much concerning intangible assets class. Okay. Normally, when we're dealing with knowledge-based assets class, when we're dealing with intellectual properties class, they will result in the recognition of an intangible asset. Intangible asset is governed by PAS 38, and PAS 38 governs the rules for recognition of intangible assets. Okay, but as far as the framework is concerned, it opens up the possibility that there can be assets based on a right that is based on the knowledge class, on a knowledge that is not known to the general public. Here, not all, this would be a good source for a true or false question class. Not all of an entity's rights are assets of that entity. Okay, so again, not all rights will ripen into an asset class. Again, we have to check the presence of all the other elements class. The right must both have the potential to produce for the economic benefits uh, for the entity, to produce for the entity economic benefits, and it must be controlled by the entity. Now, class, nowhere in the framework class can you mention of ownership class. Okay, but very common way of approaching an asset class is to link it with ownership. Okay, but as far as the framework is concerned, class, ownership is not the test for an asset class. Okay, you do not have to be the owner class. You do not have to be the owner for you to be considered an item, for a right to be considered as your asset. What is required here is control. Okay, that's a very important concept class. Ownership is not the requirement. Okay, it is only control. Even if we say control may be lower than ownership, but we are not just we are also very strict as to what we mean by control. But as a takeaway, understand that we do not limit uh, assets to those that are owned class. Okay, the important requirement here is not ownership but control. But going back to what I've mentioned, class, as a possible true or false question, just the first part of paragraph 4.9 would already be enough. Okay, all of an entity's rights are assets of that entity, and that is false because again, the right must both have the potential to produce for the entity economic benefits to the exclusion of others, and it must be controlled by the entity. Okay. Now, please take note, class. The framework is even being more specific, class. It does not mean that since you are able to receive economic benefits from that right class, it does not mean that you will already have an asset. Because it can happen that the benefit that you get class, that the benefit you will receive is common to everybody else, is available to everyone else. And in that case, then that right cannot be considered as an asset. Okay? As you go over the framework class, always take note of the examples class. Always take note of the examples. To answer the possible question wherein you will be asked which of the following is an example of this of so and so. Okay, so always jot down, always take note of specific examples given by the framework. Paragraph 4.10 class is understandable class. You cannot recognize an asset wherein the right imposes an obligation to yourself as well. Okay? You cannot report an asset. You cannot report an asset wherein the entity that is obligated to provide benefits under that right will just be yourself. Okay, that simply is absurd. That simply does not make sense, class. But on a particular application class, on a more concrete application, I'd like you to focus on paragraph B in 4.10. Here, class, although again, this is also contained in PFRS 10 class, the preparation of consolidated financial statements. Okay, so I hope you're familiar already with the parent and the subsidiary relationship class. Parent is an entity that has control over the subsidiary. Okay, the parent class, the parent is a separate legal entity. The subsidiary is also a separate legal entity. Okay, but by fiction of accounting class, there is a third entity. And this third entity is the combination of the parent and the subsidiary. And following the separate entity assumption, the third entity is an entity separate and distinct from the parent, separate and distinct from the subsidiary. So when we're dealing with parents and subsidiaries class, we're dealing with three entities really: the parent on its own, the subsidiary on its own, and the consolidated entity. So it's possible, class, that the parent has a receivable from the subsidiary. It's possible that the parent has a receivable from the subsidiary. So on the part of the parent will report an asset. On the part of the subsidiary, it will report a liability. But in the eyes of the consolidated entity class, in the eyes of the consolidated entity, the parent and the subsidiary is just a component of itself. So even if in reality the parent has a receivable from the subsidiary, in the eyes of the consolidated entity, in the perspective of the consolidated entity, no receivable, no payable exists. Because the parent is the consolidated entity. The subsidiary is also the consolidated entity. So the consolidated entity cannot be a debtor to itself. Okay, so that's an application of this provision of the framework that an entity cannot have a right to obtain economic benefits from itself.